wind howled across the New Mexico desert, carrying grit and the sour reek of whiskey through the cracks in the sod cabin walls. Inside, 10-year-old Caleb pressed himself flat against the cold dirt floor, his breath catching as the shadow of his father, Silas, loomed over his trembling younger sister. The sharp crack of the riding crop against the table leg was a promise of pain. Escape wasn't a dream. It was a necessity whispered on the desert wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The mesa loomed like a brooding giant in the fading light, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw towards a solitary cabin huddled at the edge of Rattler Creek. Dust devils danced across the cracked earth, swirling around brittle sagebrush and the bleached bones of some long-dead steer. Inside the cabin, the air hung thick and stale, saturated with the acrid tang of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies and despair. Caleb Hayes watched the spider struggle in the dusty web strung across the corner of the single grimy window. He was small for 10, wiry and sharp-eyed, his face already etched with vigilance far beyond his years. Every creak of the warped floorboards, every shift of the wind outside, was cataloged. Beside him, 8-year-old Liza clutched a ragged cornhusk doll, her wide, gray eyes fixed on the door. 5-year-old Ben, curled against Caleb's side, whimpered softly in his sleep, a faint bruise blooming on his thin arm from the previous night's outburst. Their world was defined by the heavy, uneven tread of Silas Hayes. He'd returned from a saloon hours ago, a storm brewing in his bloodshot eyes. Now he slumped at the rickety table, nursing the dregs from a chipped bottle, the polished hickory handle of his riding crop resting ominously beside it. The silence was a taut wire, humming with dread. Liza's stomach growled, a small, desperate sound that shattered the quiet like dropped glass. Silas's head snapped up, his eyes, bleary and unfocused, zeroed in on her. "What's that?" he slurred, his voice gravelly and dangerous. "Griping again? Think food just falls from the damn sky." Liza flinched, shrinking back against Caleb. "No, Pa," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just hungry is all." "Hungry?" Silas slammed his fist on the table, making the bottle jump. Ben startled awake, his whimper turning into a frightened cry. "I bust my back digging for silver that ain't there, putting food you don't appreciate in your ungrateful bellies. And you got the gall to whine." He snatched up the riding crop, its leather tongue slithering against the rough wood of the tabletop. The sound sent ice through Caleb's veins. Caleb acted without thought, pure instinct honed by years of survival. He shoved Liza behind him, placing his own thin body between her and their father. "She didn't mean nothing, Pa," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the frantic hammering of his heart. "We're quiet. We'll be quiet." Silas's gaze locked onto Caleb. A slow, ugly smile spread across his weathered face. "Oh, the little rooster crows, does he?" Defending his hen. He pushed himself up, swaying slightly. The riding crop tapped rhythmically against his thigh. "Maybe you need a reminder of who rules this roost, boy." He took a step forward. Caleb braced himself, every muscle coiled. He knew the bite of that crop, the sharp sting that bloomed into a deep, throbbing ache. He'd bear it. He always did. For Liza, for Ben. His eyes darted past Silas, towards a small, high window. Beyond it lay the rutted track leading into Rattler Creek, and a mercantile run by Eli and Martha Claiborne. He'd seen them yesterday. Eli, tall and quiet, handing a stick of peppermint to a little girl whose mother bought flour. Martha, her eyes warm and sad as she watched the child skip away, her hand resting unconsciously on her own flat belly. There was a kindness there, a stillness utterly foreign to the chaos of the Hayes cabin. Caleb had felt a strange pull, a flicker of something perilously close to hope. He'd overheard Miss Gable, the preacher's wife, murmur to Martha on the boardwalk, "Such a shame, dear. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Fine folks like you, wanting a family so bad." Martha had just smiled that sad, gentle smile and touched Miss Gable's arm. Now, facing the advancing storm that was Silas, that memory felt like a fragile lifeline. The Clays, Caleb thought desperately. They got food. They got quiet. Maybe they got mercy. Silas raised the crop. The air crackled. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut for a split second, bracing for the impact. When he opened them, his gaze caught on the chipped blue enamel mug on the shelf. His ma's mug, the only thing left of her. A sudden gust of wind rattled the ill-fitting door, whistling through the cracks. It carried the scent of rain on dry earth, a fleeting promise of cleansing, distant and unreachable. The crop whistled down, not towards Caleb, but towards a mug. It connected with a sharp crack. The blue enamel shattered, shards skittering across the dirt floor like fallen stars. Silas roared, a sound of pure, drunken fury. Useless junk, like everything else in this cursed hole. In the shocked silence that followed the shattering, Caleb saw it. A plan, desperate and half-formed, crystallized. They couldn't stay. Not another night. The image of Martha Claiborne's kind eyes burned in his mind. The mercantile, safety, food, family. He met Liza's terrified gaze and gave the tiniest, almost imperceptible nod towards a back window, partially obscured by a ragged burlap sack. Be ready. Silas, momentarily distracted by the destruction he'd wrought, stumbled towards the shattered pieces, cursing incoherently. This was their chance. While his back was turned, while the rage was momentarily spent on an inanimate object. Tonight! Caleb mouthed silently to Liza, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. We go tonight, to the Clays. Liza's eyes widened, filled with a terrified hope. Ben, sensing the shift, clung tighter to Caleb's shirt. The wind moaned outside, louder now. It sounded less like a lament and more like a call. Silas kicked at the shards, sending them skittering. He turned, his face flushed, his breathing heavy. He looked from the broken mug to his children, huddled together. A fresh wave of anger seemed to darken his features. Clean this mess up, he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at the debris. Every last piece, or you'll feel this crop on your hides, till you can't sit for a week. He lurched towards a door, grabbing his stained hat. Gotta see a man about a mule, he muttered, though Caleb knew it meant another long session at the Rattlesnake Saloon. He used it in a term before midnight, bloated with liquor and bile, as the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the cabin into a deeper gloom. Caleb let out a shaky breath. The immediate threat had passed, replaced by the terrifying enormity of their decision. They had a few hours. They had a destination. They had a sliver of hope as fragile as the broken enamel on the floor. He knelt, picking up a large blue shard. Its edge was sharp. He carefully gathered the pieces, his mind racing. They'd need to move like shadows. Stick to the back alleys of Rattler Creek. Hope Silas stayed good and drunk. Hope the Clays were still awake when they knocked. Hope they'd open the door. Gather what you can carry, Caleb whispered urgently to Liza and Ben as he scooped the last shards into a tin can. Just the warm things. And quiet like mice. Liza nodded, scrambling to bundle their thin blankets. Ben, wide-eyed but trusting, clutched his corn-husk doll. The wind battered the cabin again, a mournful sound that now carried an edge of urgency. Caleb stuffed a few pitiful belongings they owned, an extra shirt, a worn shawl, a smooth river stone Ben treasured, into a burlap sack. He tied the tin can of broken enamel inside, too. It was all he had left of her. They waited as the last light bled from the sky, painting the mesa in bruised purples and deep reds. The sounds of the town drifted faintly on the wind. A piano tinkling from the saloon, a distant shout, the mournful bray of a donkey. When the darkness felt thick enough to hide them, Caleb moved to the back window. It was small, its frame warped, but he'd loosened the rusty nails weeks ago, just in case. He pried it open with trembling fingers, the screech of wood against it sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Liza first, he whispered, boosting her slight frame up. She wriggled through, landing with a soft thud on the hard-packed earth outside. He passed Ben down to her waiting arms, then the sack. Taking one last look at the squalid room that had been their prison, Caleb hauled himself out, pulling the window almost shut behind him. The desert night air was cold and sharp, smelling of sage and distant rain. Freedom tasted like dust on his tongue. Holding Ben's hand tightly, with Liza close behind, Caleb led them away from the cabin, keeping to the deeper shadows cast by the looming mesa. They moved silently like wraiths, towards a faint, welcoming glow of kerosene lamps that marked the main street of Rattler Creek, toward the mercantile, toward the Clays. They were halfway across the open stretch behind the blacksmith's forge, the town's lights tantalizingly close, when Caleb froze. A new sound cut through the night. Not the wind, not the distant saloon noise. It was a rhythmic, unmistakable clop-clop of a single horse approaching fast from the direction of town. Too fast. And the silhouette against the starlit sky, slumped and bulky in the saddle, was horribly familiar. Silas. He was back, hours early, and he was heading straight for the cabin, cutting off their path to the mercantile. The fragile hope Caleb had nurtured shattered like the blue enamel mug. They were exposed, caught in the open, with nowhere to run but back into the suffocating darkness they had just escaped, or forward into the path of the storm riding towards them. The rhythmic clop-clop of Silas's horse hammered against Caleb's ribs like a second, terrified heartbeat. The silhouette against the star-dusted sky was unmistakable. The slouched bulk, the wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He was heading straight for the cabin, cutting diagonally across the open ground between the blacksmith's forge and the distant cluster of town buildings. The mercantile's welcoming glow seemed suddenly miles away. "Down!" Caleb hissed, shoving Liza and Ben flat into the cold, gritty sand behind a stack of warped wagon wheels leaning against the forge. He pressed himself beside them, the burlap sack digging into his back. Ben whimpered, burying his face in Caleb's side. Liza clutched her doll, so tightly the corn husks crackled faintly. The hoof beats grew louder, vibrating through the earth. Caleb risked a peek around a wheel rim. Silas swayed in the saddle, his head lolling slightly, drunker than usual. Good. Maybe he wouldn't look their way. The horse, a tired-looking bay, plodded steadily closer. Caleb held his breath, every nerve screaming. If Silas glanced left, even blearly, he'd see them, 3 pale smudges against the dark forge wall. The horse's head dipped as it passed the water trough near the forge entrance. Silas muttered something unintelligible, tugging roughly on the reins to turn the animal toward the cabin path. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He slumped forward, seemingly focused only on the dark outline of the hovel he called home. The hoofbeats receded, heading back the way the children had come. Caleb waited until the sound faded completely, swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. Only the sighing wind and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote remained. He sagged against the cold wood, trembling. "Okay," he breathed, the words shaky. "Okay." He's going to the cabin. We gotta move. Fast and quiet. Like ghosts. Liza nodded, her eyes wide pools of fear in the dim starlight. Ben sniffled, clutching his river stone. Caleb scanned the path ahead. They needed to circle wide, avoiding the direct route Silas had taken, sticking to the deeper shadows cast by the backs of buildings. The livery stable, the feed store, the barber shop with striped pole faintly visible. The alleyways of Rattler Creek at night were a different world. Pools of inky blackness broken by the occasional spill of lamplight from an unshuttered window, the scent of dust and manure and stale beer hanging heavy in the cold air. They move in a tight huddle, Caleb leading, Liza clutching Ben's hand. Every rustle in the sagebrush made them freeze. Every creak of a swinging sign felt like a shout. Passing the livery stable, the sharp smell of hay and horse sweat momentarily overwhelmed the desert air. A dog barked sharply from within, making them jump. Caleb pressed him flat against the rough plank wall, hearts pounding. The bark subsided into a low growl, then silence. They scurried on, rounding the corner behind the feed store, They almost collided with a figure stumbling out of a narrow gap between buildings. The reek of cheap whiskey hit Caleb like a physical blow. It was Jed Hawkins, a mule skinner known to spend his wages at the Rattlesnake before sleeping it off in alleyways. He blinked owlishly at the children, swaying on his feet. "Well, looky here," he slurred, peering down. "Little haze rats. Out past your bedtime, ain't ya? Silas know your skulk around?" Caleb's blood ran cold. He stepped slightly in front of the siblings. Just heading home, Mr. Hawkins," he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. Hawkins squinted, his gaze drifting over them, lingering on the burlap sack. "Home's that way, boy." He jerked a thumb vaguely toward the outskirts. "Looks like you're going the wrong direction." He took an unsteady step closer. "What you got in the sack? Eh? Something shiny?" Caleb's hand tightened on Ben's shoulder. He remembered the sharp edge of the blue enamel shard in the tin, and inside the sack. Could he use it? Would he? The thought sickened him. Before he could move, a sudden clatter echoed from the main street, the sound of a kicked-over bucket. Hawkins's head snapped toward the noise, distracted. "Dang fool drunks," he muttered, forgetting the children momentarily. He lurched off toward the commotion, disappearing into deeper shadows near the saloon. Caleb didn't wait. "Run!" he whispered fiercely, pulling Liza and Ben toward the alley mouth opposite the feed store. They darted across the open space, hearts hammering, and pressed themselves into the welcoming gloom of the next alley. The Mercantile was now just across the wide main street. Its windows glowed warmly, a beacon in the oppressive night. Caleb could see shapes moving inside. Eli Claiborne stacking cans, Martha wiping the counter. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. Almost there. But the main street was exposed, lit by the spill of light from the saloon and the Mercantile itself. Anyone could see them. "Stay low," Caleb instructed, scanning the street. A few cowhands ambled near the saloon entrance, but their attention was inward. The preacher, Mr. Gable, was locking the church door further down. No sign of Hawkins, or, worse, Silas. "Follow me. Quick." Holding Ben tight against his hip, Caleb led the dash across the packed Earth Street. They felt horribly visible, tiny figures darting through the island of light. Caleb's eyes were fixed on the Mercantile door. "Please be open. Please see us." They reached the relative safety of the raised wooden boardwalk in front of the Mercantile. Caleb hesitated only a second, his small fist raised, knuckles white. He rapped sharply, 3 times, the sound echoing in the sudden stillness of their fear. The shapes inside paused. Martha Claiborne looked towards the door, her expression unreadable from this angle. Eli stopped stacking cans. Caleb knocked again, harder this time, desperation lending force. "Please." The door opened a crack, held by a chain. Martha Claiborne's face appeared, framed by the warm light. Her eyes, kind but cautious, widened in shock as she took in 3 filthy, trembling children huddled on her doorstep. Caleb saw her gaze sweep over Ben's bruise, Liza's tear-streaked face, his own desperate eyes. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, heavens above," she breathed, her voice thick with sudden emotion. The chain rattled as she fumbled with it. Eli, come quick." The door swung open fully. Eli Claiborne appeared behind his wife, his tall frame filling the doorway. His weathered face, usually calm and reserved, registered profound surprise that quickly deepened into concern as he absorbed the scene. He stepped aside wordlessly, ushering them in with a sweep of his arm. Martha was already reaching out, her hands gentle but urgent. Inside, children, quickly now out of the cold. "Come in." The warmth of the Mercantile enveloped them, a stark, almost shocking contrast to the desert night. It smelled of coffee beans, dried apples, leather, and clean wood. Caleb stumbled inside, pulling Liza and Ben with him. The door clicked shut behind them, muffling the outside world. The sudden safety, the sheer kindness radiating from Martha as she knelt before them, her eyes soft and brimming with unshed tears, was overwhelming. Caleb's rigid posture sagged. Liza began to sob quietly into her doll. Ben just stared wide-eyed, clutching his stone. Martha reached out, her touch feather-light, brushing a strand of dirty hair from Liza's forehead. "You poor lambs," she murmured, her voice thick. "You're safe now. You're safe." She looked up at Eli, her expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and a deep, aching sorrow Caleb couldn't fully comprehend. "Eli, the blankets from the back. And the kettle, please. They're frozen through." Eli nodded, his gaze lingering on the children with a quiet intensity Caleb had never seen directed at him before. Not pity, but profound, almost painful recognition. He moved swiftly toward the back room. Martha gently guided them towards a pot-bellied stove glowing warmly in the corner. "Sit here, dears. Warm yourselves." She helped Ben and Liza onto a stack of grain sacks covered with a rough horse blanket. Caleb remained standing, swaying slightly, the burlap sack still clutched in his hand. He couldn't relax yet. Silas was out there. Jed Hawkins had seen them. The mercantile walls felt solid, but were they strong enough? As Martha busied herself finding cups, her back momentarily turned. Caleb's eyes darted to the large front window. Movement outside caught his eye. A figure paused on the boardwalk across the street, near the saloon entrance. It was Amos, the livery stable hand, a man known to share a bottle with Silas. Amos was staring directly at the mercantile window, his gaze sharp and curious. He'd seen them enter. Before Caleb could react, Amos turned and ducked into the Rattlesnake Saloon. A cold dread, colder than the desert night, seeped into Caleb's bones. He knew exactly who Amos would tell. Just then, Eli returned, arms laden with thick wool blankets. He followed Caleb's gaze to the window, his brow furrowing slightly as he noted Amos's disappearance into saloon. He placed the blankets down and walked to the window, peering out into the night, his posture suddenly alert, protective. "Martha," Eli said, his voice low and grave. "Bolt the back door to." Martha paused, the tin mug in her hand hovering over the steaming kettle. She looked from Eli's serious face to Caleb's terrified one. Understanding dawned in her eyes, mixed with a flicker of fear. She nodded mutely and hurried toward the back of the store. The warmth of the stove couldn't penetrate the icy fear that gripped Caleb. The sanctuary felt fragile, temporary. He heard it then, faint but growing louder from the direction of the saloon, raised, angry voices. One voice, thick and furious, rose above the others. A voice that scraped like sandpaper on raw wounds. Silas. He knew where they were, and he was coming. Silas's voice, raw and thick with fury, cut through the mercantile's fragile warmth like a rusty blade. "Hayes brats, I know you're in there. Claiborne. Send 'em out, or I'll tear this place down board by board." The threat was punctuated by a heavy thud against the sturdy oak door, making the jars on the shelves rattle. Outside, the wind howled its own protest, carrying the sour reek of saloon smoke and dust. Ben buried his face in Martha's skirts with a choked sob. Liza froze, her cornhusk doll pressed tight against her chest, eyes wide with primal terror. Caleb flinched violently, the sound of his father's rage instantly stripping away the fleeting sense of safety. His body remembered the sting of the crop, the unpredictable fury. He instinctively stepped back, bumping against a sack of flour. Eli Claiborne moved with a calm that felt like bedrock. He didn't flinch at the pounding. Instead, he placed himself squarely in front of the door, his tall frame blocking the view through the small, reinforced window. His expression was grim, resolute. "Stay behind the counter, Martha," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying an authority Caleb had never heard directed against Silas. "Keep the children there." Martha, pale but composed, gathered Liza and Ben closer, her arms encircling them protectively. She guided Caleb back too, her touch on his shoulder firm and reassuring. "He won't get in, Caleb," she murmured, though her eyes flickered with fear she couldn't entirely hide. "The door's strong. Eli's strong. Caleb wanted to believe her. The mercantile's warmth, the scent of cinnamon sticks and coffee beans, the solidity of the shelves laden with goods. It was everything the sod cabin wasn't. Yet Silas's shadow loomed large, a dark stain on the lamplight spilling across the floorboards. The pounding intensified. "Open this door, Claiborne. They're my young uns. You got no right. They came here frightened and hurt, Silas." Eli called back, his voice carrying clearly through the wood, "Seeking shelter. That's all any decent man would offer." "Shelter?" Silas's laugh was harsh, scraping. "They're thieves and liars. Ran off with my property. Now hand 'em over before this gets ugly." Caleb's heart hammered. Property. The word stung. He wasn't a stolen shovel. He was a boy who just wanted his sister not to be hungry, his brother not to be bruised. His hand tightened on the burlap sack, still looped over his shoulder, the tin can inside heavy with the shards of the blue enamel mug. Ma's mug. The memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. His mother, years ago, humming softly while pouring chicory into that very mug, her hand gentle on his head. A rare moment of peace before the cough took her, before Silas drowned in the bottle. That fragile beauty, shattered like the enamel, just like their chance of peace now seemed shattered. Martha, sensing his distress, gently squeezed his shoulder again, as Silas continued his tirade outside, punctuated by kicks against the door. She leaned closer to the children, her voice a soft counterpoint to the chaos. "Don't you listen to that noise," she whispered, her eyes holding Caleb's. "You listen to me. You did the bravest thing coming here." Her gaze drifted to Ben, gently wiping a tear from his cheek with her apron corner. "My Eli and I, we lost a little boy. Years back. Fever took him quick." Her voice hitched, thick with old, deep grief. "Samuel, he'd be about your age now, Caleb." She looked at Liza, then Ben, her eyes shimmering. "We know what it is to ache for a child, to want to keep one safe." The raw honesty in her words struck Caleb deeper than any of Silas's shouts. This wasn't just kindness. It was an understanding forged in their own loss. Eli's quiet strength at the door, Martha's fierce protectiveness. It came from a place of profound emptiness they desperately wanted to fill. For a fleeting moment, Caleb dared to imagine belonging here, in this warm, clean space filled with the scent of good things, watched over by these quiet, sorrowful people who understood loss. The fragile moment shattered not by Silas, but by a sharp, official rap on the door, different from Silas's drunken pounding. "Claiborne, Eli Claiborne. Open up. It's Deputy Morgan." Eli's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. He exchanged a swift, worried glance with Martha. Silas's furious ranting outside subsided into a low, satisfied growl. "Told you, Claiborne. Law's here now. Open up." Eli slowly slid the bolt back and opened the door just enough to see out, his body still blocking the interior. Deputy Morgan, a lean man with a star pinned to his worn vest and a weary expression, stood on the boardwalk. Silas hovered behind him, breathing heavily, his eyes burning with malice as he tried to peer around Eli. "Evening, Eli," Morgan said, his voice neutral but his eyes taking the scene inside, Martha sheltering the clearly terrified Hayes children. "Got a complaint here from Silas. Says his children ran off and you're harboring them unlawfully." "They came here seeking refuge, Deputy," Eli stated calmly. "They were cold, frightened, and the young one bears a bruise. We offer them shelter. That's not harboring. That's Christian charity." "Charity?" Silas spat, shoving forward, but Morgan held up a hand, stopping him. "Their place is with their pa. Eli, bruise or not," Morgan said, his tone regretful but firm. "You know how it is. Bloodkin. Law's clear on that. Unless there's proof of immediate danger the law recognizes." He trailed off, his gaze flicking to Ben's faint bruise, then away. It was a common sight in Rattler Creek, rarely warranting intervention. Best send him out. Avoid trouble. "Immediate danger is standing right there, Deputy." Martha's voice, usually so gentle, rang out sharp with indignation as she stepped slightly forward, still keeping the children shielded. Look at them. They're terrified of him. He's my flesh and blood. Silas roared, his control fraying. They belong with me. That woman's got no call interfering. Caleb felt the hope leaching out of him, replaced by the cold certainty of Silas's victory. The law, the deputy, the town, they sided with the father, no matter what. He saw it in Morgan's resigned expression. The Claibornes' kindness, their own sorrow, wasn't enough against the harsh reality of Silas's claim. He looked down at the burlap sack, the broken pieces of his mother's mug, the shattered symbol of any gentleness in their past, felt like the shattered pieces of their future. Suddenly, Caleb acted. He couldn't let Silas win without a fight. Not after feeling this warmth, this glimpse of what could be. He slipped the sack off his shoulder and thrust it towards Martha. "It's all we took, Miss Claiborne," he said loudly, his voice trembling but clear, meant for the deputy and Silas to hear. "Pa broke it. Ma's mug. He broke it when he was mad. We just gathered the pieces." He met Martha's eyes, pouring all his desperation, all his trust into that look. See what he does? Martha's eyes widened in understanding. She took the sack, her fingers brushing the cold tin can inside. She held it up slightly, not opening it, but the gesture was clear. "Is this the property they supposedly stole, deputy? Silas?" Broken pieces of a cup their father destroyed in a rage. Silas's face purpled. "That's mine. Everything in that shack's mine. Them included. Now hand him over." Deputy Morgan shifted uncomfortably, looking from the sack to Silas's livid face, then to the children cowering behind Martha. The legal lines were blurring. Before he could speak, Silas, enraged beyond reason by Caleb's defiance and Martha's challenge, lunged. He shoved past Deputy Morgan and threw his weight against the door Eli was still partially holding. Eli, caught off balance, staggered back a step. The door flew open wide. Silas Hayes stood framed in the mercantile entrance, the cold desert wind swirling in around him, his eyes wild, fixed on Caleb. Behind him, Deputy Morgan reached for his arm, but Silas shook him off. His gaze swept the room, landing on his children with predatory intensity. "You!" he snarled, pointing a shaking finger directly at Caleb, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouts. "You're coming home. Now. And you're going to learn what happens to ungrateful whelps who shame their pa." He took a heavy step inside, the riding crop visible now, gripped tight in his fist. Eli moved to block him again, but Silas's focus was solely on Caleb, a promise of retribution burning in his bloodshot eyes. Caleb stood frozen, trapped between the warmth of Martha behind him and the icy hatred radiating from his father filling the doorway. The sanctuary was breached. The law was hesitant. And Silas's fury was a living thing, reaching for him. Silas filled the mercantile doorway, a storm of whiskey and rage. The riding crop trembled in his fist, its polished hickory catching the lamplight like a threat. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Caleb, ignoring Eli's solid frame blocking his path, Martha's protective stance, Deputy Morgan's uneasy presence. "You!" Silas breathed, the word thick with venom. "You little traitor. Think these soft-handed fools can save you?" Caleb stood frozen, caught between the radiating hatred of his father and the desperate warmth at his back, where Martha shielded Liza and Ben. He felt Ben's small body trembling violently against Martha's skirts, heard Liza's choked gasp. The familiar icy dread threatened to paralyze him, the memory of the crop sting vivid on his skin. But beneath the fear, a spark ignited. Defiance fanned by Martha's fierce embrace, Eli's unyielding posture, and the weight of the shattered mug pieces still held in Martha's hand. They see him. They know. Eli didn't flinch. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Silas and Caleb, his voice low and dangerous, a tone Caleb had never heard from the quiet storekeeper. "You take one step toward that boy, Silas, and you'll answer to me. Deputy or no deputy? Silas let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. You? What are you going to do? Shopkeep? Throw a sack of flour at me? He swiped the crop through the air, the leather tongue hissing. That boy's mine. His shame's mine to correct. Step aside. Deputy Morgan moved then, placing a firm hand on Silas's shoulder. Hold on now, Silas. Let's do this proper. No need for trouble inside Eli's place. His voice held authority, but his eyes darted toward the terrified children, a flicker of unease betraying his official stance. The law says they go with you, but we'll do it calm-like. Calm, Silas roared, shrugging off Morgan's hand. His focus remained solely on Caleb, a predator fixated. After he shamed me, ran off, stole. He gestured wildly towards a burlap sack Martha held. Took what's mine, just like his no-good ma, always Taquine. The bitter accusation hung in the air, a raw wound exposed. Caleb flinched. The mention of his mother unlocked a sudden, sharp memory. Her face, pale but serene, sitting on the edges caught years ago, brushing his hair back as he drifted to sleep. You got a good heart, Caleb boy, she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Strong, too. You look after Liza and Ben when I can't. Her hand had been cool, her touch gentle, the absolute opposite of Silas's looming menace. That quiet strength, that charge to protect, surged through him now, pushing back the icy fear. We didn't steal. Caleb's voice rang out, clearer and stronger than he felt. He pointed at the sack in Martha's hand. That's Ma's mug, the one you broke. We just picked up the pieces, 'cause it was all we had left of her. His voice cracked on the last word, but he held his father's gaze, the defiance burning bright. Silas's face contorted. The accusation, the reminder of his own destructive rage, seemed to momentarily unbalance him. His eyes flickered to the sack, then back to Caleb, a complex mix of fury and something else, shame, flashing across his features. He swayed slightly, the whiskey's grip tightening. Shut your lie mouth, he bellowed, but the force was blunted by a sudden unsteadiness. He took a heavy step forward, raising the crop. Eli moved instantly, not to strike, but to block. He caught Silas's wrist just as the crop began its downward arc. Silas, caught off guard by Eli's unexpected strength and his own drunkenness, stumbled. His boot caught on the uneven floorboard near the threshold. With a surprised grunt, he lost his balance completely, crashing heavily onto the mercantile floorboards, the riding crop clattering from his grasp and skittering away under a display barrel. A stunned silence fell. Silas lay sprawled, momentarily winded, blinking up at the ceiling beams. Deputy Morgan quickly knelt beside him, more to restrain than assist. All right, Silas, that's enough. You're done. Caleb felt Martha's arms tighten around him and his siblings. Eli stood over Silas, breathing hard, his expression grim but resolute. He looked at Deputy Morgan. You see what he is, Morgan? Drunk and dangerous. You're going to hand these children back to that. Deputy Morgan looked from the prone, cursing Silas to the huddled children, then to Eli's determined face and Martha's tear-filled, defiant eyes. He sighed, the weight of his duty heavy. Law's the law, Eli. He's their blood kin. Unless a judge says otherwise, or unless there's witnesses willing to swear out a complaint about more than just a bruise and a broken cup, my hands are tied. He hauled Silas to his feet, who swayed, glaring murderously but momentarily subdued by the fall and Morgan's firm grip. Before Eli or Martha could argue, a new voice cut through the tense air from the still open doorway. Deputy Morgan? Everything under control here. A tall, gaunt man stood on the boardwalk, silhouetted against the night. He wore a dark, travel-stained suit and carried a worn leather satchel. His face was severe, deeply lined, bearing a faint, unsettling resemblance to Silas, though colder, sharper. Silas stiffened, his drunken belligerence replaced by a wary, almost fearful recognition. Josiah, Silas muttered, his voice suddenly flat. The man, Josiah, stepped inside, his sharp eyes taking the scene. The disheveled children, the protective Clayburns, his brother held by the deputy, the riding crop lying under the barrel. "Silas," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, heard the commotion clear down the street, causing trouble again. His gaze settled on Caleb, Liza, and Ben, a calculating glint in his eyes. "These the young uns?" Deputy Morgan nodded, relieved at the interruption. "Josiah Hayes. Just arrived on the evening stage, I reckon? Your brother here was trying to collect his children. Got a bit carried away." Josiah's thin lips pressed into a line. He looked at Silas with open contempt. "Drunk again, Silas? Can't even manage your own household." He turned his attention back to the children, his gaze lingering on their worn clothes and fearful expressions, then flicking to the Clayburns. "My name is Josiah Hayes, Silas's elder brother. I handle family matters." He opened his satchel and withdrew a folded document sealed with wax. "I hold the lien on Silas's claim, such as it is," and he added, his voice dropping to a chillingly businesslike tone, "in the unfortunate event of his continued incapacity, or should his debts come due, the welfare and placement of his minor dependents falls under my purview, as next of kin and primary creditor." The words landed like stones in the quiet mercantile. Caleb felt Martha's grip tighten convulsively. Eli's jaw clenched. This wasn't just Silas's drunken rage anymore. This was cold legal leverage. Josiah tapped the document against his palm. "I've been informed of tonight's disturbance and the children's flight." His sharp eyes fixed on Clayburns. "While your charitable impulse is noted, harboring minors without parental consent is a serious matter. Deputy Morgan is correct. The law is clear. These children belong with their family." He glanced dismissively at Silas, "or with whomever the law deems their proper guardian." Silas bristled, but remained silent under his brother's icy stare and Morgan's firm hold. Josiah offered Silas a look that was pure disdain. "Get yourself cleaned up, brother. We have business to discuss in the morning, matters of debt and responsibility." He turned back to Deputy Morgan. "I assume you can ensure my brother causes no further disruption tonight, and that the children will be returned to their rightful place come daylight? I will be lodging at the boarding house." Deputy Morgan nodded, clearly relieved to have a seemingly more reasonable Hayes to deal with. "He'll cool his heels in a cell tonight, Josiah. Sober up. Children can stay here under Eli and Martha's watch till morning, seeing as it's late and they're settled." But come sunup, he trailed off, his meaning clear. Josiah gave a curt nod. "Sunup, then." He cast one last, appraising look over the children and the Clayburns, his expression unreadable. "Good evening." He turned and walked out into the night, his footsteps precise and unhurried on the boardwalk. Deputy Morgan guided a sullen, suddenly subdued Silas out after him, toward the jail. As the door closed, Eli swiftly slid the bolt back into place. The sound was final, but the sanctuary felt more fragile than ever. The silence that followed was thick with shock and dread. Ben began to cry softly again. Liza buried her face in Martha's apron. Caleb stared at the closed door, Josiah's cold words echoing in his mind. Proper guardian. Debts. Sunup. Martha sank to her knees, pulling all three children into a fierce embrace. "Oh, my dears," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and a new, steely resolve. "Don't you fret." Eli placed a large, steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. His face was grim, etched with worry, but his eyes burned with a determination Caleb hadn't seen before. "That man," Eli said, his voice low and hard, "thinks the law and a piece of paper give him the right. But there's more than one kind of claim, Caleb." He looked at Martha, then back at the children. "We won't let them take you back to that. Not without a fight the likes of which Rattler Creek hasn't seen." He walked to the window, peering out into the darkness where Josiah Hayes had disappeared. "Sunup brings more than light," Eli murmured, almost himself. "It brings reckonings." He turned back, his gaze meeting Caleb's. "We'll need a plan, and we'll need help. before that man decides what proper guardianship looks like, or what price he's willing to pay for Silas's debts. The warmth of the stove fought against a new chill seeping into the room. The immediate threat of Silas's crop was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating shadow of Josiah Hayes and the relentless approach of dawn. Their sanctuary wasn't just threatened. It was being measured, assessed, and potentially sold to the highest bidder. Dawn bled into sky over Rattler Creek, staining the eastern mesa a bruised purple before washing it in streaks of pale gold. Inside the Claiborne mercantile, the air hummed with a taut, fearful energy, thick as the dust motes dancing in the first slanting rays of light. Caleb stood by the window, watching the town stir. The promise of sunup felt less like hope and more like the ticking of a fateful clock. Josiah Hayes' cold pronouncement, "Sunup, then," echoed in his mind, colder than the desert night had been. Martha moved quietly, setting out 10 cups of weak chicory coffee. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face was set in lines of fierce determination. She'd spent the scant hours of darkness gathering their meager evidence. The burlap sack containing the tin can of blue enamel shards and a clean linen cloth she'd carefully wrapped around Ben's thin arm, covering the fading bruise like a damning exhibit. Eli paced near the bolted door, his tall frame radiating a quiet, simmering anger. He'd sent word with the milk boy to Preacher Gable and Miss Gable, a desperate plea for support, for witnesses to the children's fear and Silas's nature. "They'll come," Martha murmured, more to herself than anyone, as she smoothed Liza's tangled hair. Liza clutched a cornhusk doll, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. Ben sat silently on a sack of grain, his river stone held tightly in his fist, his thumb rubbing its smooth surface, a tiny anchor in a storm-tossed sea. "What if the preacher won't stand against Josiah?" Caleb asked, his voice small. He remembered Josiah's sharp suit, the official-looking document, the cold calculation in his eyes. He seemed like a man who knew how to bend the world to his will. Eli stopped pacing. He placed a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Then we stand alone, son. But we stand. We tell the truth. We show them this." He gestured toward the sack and Ben's covered arm. "And we pray that truth carries more weight than a lean paper in the eyes of decent folk." The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside sent a jolt through them all. It wasn't the heavy tread of Deputy Morgan or the precise steps of Josiah. It was Preacher Gable, his kind face grave, followed by Miss Gable carrying a basket. Miss Gable's eyes immediately filled with tears as she saw the children huddled by the stove. "Oh, you poor lambs," she breathed, setting the basket down and rushing to Martha's side. "We came as soon as we could. Silas Hayes, that man." She shook her head, unable to finish. Preacher Gable looked at Eli, then at the children, his expression sorrowful but resolute. Deputy Morgan sent word. He's convening a hearing. In the church. Silas is there, sobered up some, looking meaner than a corner rattler. Josiah Hayes arrived just before me, looking like he owns the place. He sighed. "The law, it's a blunt instrument, Eli, but hearts can sway it. We'll speak. We'll stand with you." The walk to the small clapboard church felt like a march to the gallows. Rattler Creek watched. Curtains twitched in windows. Men paused their morning chores, leaning on shovels or hitching posts, their expressions ranging from indifference to morbid curiosity. Amos stood outside the livery, his face impassive. Caleb kept his head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, Liza's cold hand clasped tightly in his. Ben clinging to Martha's skirt. Inside the church, the air was still and smelled of old wood, wax, and dust. Sunlight streamed through the plain windows, the illuminating motes dancing over the rows of rough-hewn pews. Deputy Morgan stood near the simple pulpit, looking uncomfortable. Josiah Hayes sat primly in the front pew, his leather satchel beside him, surveying the room with detached superiority. Silas sat slumped beside him, radiating sullen fury, his eyes bloodshot and fixed on Caleb with undisguised hatred. A handful of townsfolk, including Miss Gable, Jed Hawkins nursing a hangover, and the blacksmith, filled the back pews. Deputy Morgan cleared his throat. All right, we're here to settle the matter of Caleb, Liza, and Benjamin Hayes. Their pa, Silas Hayes, claims his right. His brother, Mr. Josiah Hayes, speaks of the family's interests. Eli and Martha Claiborne are off-air in shelter. Preacher? Josiah stood smoothly, cutting off Preacher Gable before he could begin. Thank you, Deputy. His voice was crisp, carrying effortlessly in the quiet space. He withdrew the document. The facts are simple. These children absconded from their lawful home last night, causing distress and disruption. They were found harbored by the Claibornes without parental consent, a questionable act at best. He ignored Eli's sharp intake of breath. I hold the lien on Silas Hayes' property, including his claim, which by extension, due to his current indebtedness and instability, grants me significant authority regarding the welfare and placement of his dependents. Blood kinship dictates they remain within the Hayes family. I am prepared to assume guardianship, ensuring their well-being and proper upbringing away from the unfortunate influences here. He cast a dismissive glance at Silas, then at the Claibornes. His meaning was clear: away from Rattler Creek, away from you. The cold finality in his words threatened to crush Caleb. Guardianship. It sounded like another kind of prison, just with colder walls. Deputy Morgan looked at Eli. Eli Claiborne? Martha? You got something to say? Eli stood tall, Martha rising beside him, her hand resting protectively on Ben's head. Eli's voice, usually quiet, filled the church. We offered shelter to 3 children who came to our door cold, hungry, and terrified. Look at them. He gestured towards Caleb, Liza, and Ben. Look at the fear in their eyes when they look at their father. Look at the bruise on the little one's arm. Silas Hayes broke their mother's last keepsake in a drunken rage. Martha held up the burlap sack, the tin can inside clinking faintly. Is that the home they should be returned to, or handed over to a man who sees them as part of a debt settlement? Sentiment and broken crockery. Josiah scoffed. Hardly grounds to override blood and legal authority. It's grounds to show the character of the man. Martha's voice rang out, sharp with maternal fury. And the character of the man who would profit from their misery. Preacher Gable stood. Deputy folks, he began, his voice resonant. I've known Silas Hayes for years. I've seen the darkness the bottle brings him. I've seen the fear in these children's eyes long before last night. And I've known Eli and Martha Claiborne for just as long. Good, God-fearing people who've known deep sorrow. They open their doors and their hearts out of compassion, not malice. To rip these children away from the only kindness they've sought, it goes against the very spirit of this place. He gestured around the church. A murmur rippled through the small gathering. Ms. Gable nodded fiercely. Jed Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. Josiah's lip curled. Preaching won't pay Silas's debts or alter the law, preacher. The words hung there. The law, Josiah's document, his cold authority. They seemed like an immovable wall. Caleb felt the hope draining away. He saw Silas's smug satisfaction, Josiah's icy confidence. He thought of Martha's gentle hands, Eli's quiet strength, the warmth of the mercantile stove, the feeling of safety he'd only just tasted. He remembered his mother's whispered charge. You look after Liza and Ben. He couldn't let Josiah take them, not without a fight. He stepped forward, away from Martha's protective grasp, away from the pew. He stood in the center aisle, small but straight-backed, facing Deputy Morgan, Josiah, and the church. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. But his voice, when it came, was clear and carried to the rafters. Please, sir. He looked directly at Deputy Morgan, then swept his gaze over the townsfolk. My name's Caleb Hayes. That's my sister, Liza, and my brother, Ben. He pointed. Liza shrank back, but Ben peeked out from behind Martha. We ran because we were scared. Scared of Pa when he's drinking. Scared of the crop. He shuddered, remembering its hiss. We didn't steal nothing. We just picked up the pieces of Ma's mug, 'cause it was all we had left of her. His voice cracked, but he pushed on. Ms. Claiborne and Mr. Eli, they gave us blankets and coffee, and they didn't yell. They were kind. He looked at Josiah, meeting those cold, calculating eyes. Mr. Josiah, sir, you talk about proper guardianship and debts, but do you know what Liza's favorite color is? Or that Ben likes to collect smooth stones from the creek? Or that I promised Ma I'd look after him? Tears welled up, blurring his vision, but he didn't look away from Josiah's impassive face. Do you care? Or are we just property on paper? The silence that followed Caleb's words was profound. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the way a child's raw, unvarnished truth settling over the room. Ms. Gable wept quietly. The blacksmith cleared his throat, a rough, approving sound. Even Jed Hawkins stopped fidgeting, staring at Caleb with a new, grudging respect. Josiah opened his mouth, perhaps to dismiss the emotional plea as irrelevant, but Silas chose that moment to erupt. Caleb's words, the accusing stares, the preacher's judgment, Josiah's contempt, it was too much. He lurched to his feet, face purple with rage and shame. "Shut your lie mouth, you ungrateful whelp," he roared, spittle flying. He took a menacing step towards Caleb. "I'll teach you to shame me in front of—" Silas. Deputy Morgan's shout was like a whip crack. He moved swiftly, interposing himself between Silas and Caleb. "That's enough. One more step and you're back in a cell." But the damage was done. Silas's violent outburst, his raw, unchecked fury directed at his own son in the house of God, was the final, damning evidence. It confirmed every fear, every accusation. Josiah closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of pure disgust crossing his features. His brother's display had shattered any veneer of stability he tried to project. Preacher Gable stepped forward. "Deputy Morgan, folks of Rattler Creek, we have heard the law invoked. We have heard claims of debt and authority. But we have also heard the testimony of a child's heart. We have seen the fear, the bruise, the broken memory of a mother. And we have witnessed the character of Silas Hayes here, now, in this sacred space. Can any soul here, in good conscience, hand these children back into that storm? Or to a guardian whose primary interest seems rooted in a ledger book?" He looked pointedly at Josiah. "The law may be a blunt instrument, but justice has a conscience. And mine," he declared, his voice ringing, "says these children belong with the hands that offered shelter without question, kindness without condition, with Eli and Martha Claiborne." A low murmur of agreement rose from the gathered townsfolk. Ms. Gable nodded fervently. The blacksmith spoke up, his voice gravelly. "The preacher's right, Morgan. Ain't right sending and back into that." Deputy Morgan looked from the seething, disgraced Silas to the icy, frustrated Josiah, then to Claiborne standing protectively near the children, and finally to Caleb, whose small face was streaked with tears but held a desperate hope. The deputy sighed, the weight of his duty warring with the undeniable truth before him. He rubbed his jaw. "All right," he said heavily. "All right. Based on the evidence presented, the bruise, the testimony regarding Silas's violence and instability witnessed by multiple parties, including his own actions here today, and considering the offer of stable shelter and care," he paused, looking directly at Josiah. "I'm placing Caleb, Liza, and Benjamin Hayes in the temporary guardianship of Eli and Martha Claiborne, effective immediately, pending review by the circuit judge when he comes through next month." He held up a hand as Josiah started to protest. "You can state your case to the judge then, Mr. Hayes. But for now, the children stay with the Claibornes. Silas," he added, turning to the fuming man, "you cause any trouble, you so much as look at that mercantile cross-eyed, you'll be bunk in the jail till the judge arrives." "Understood." Josiah's face was a mask of cold fury. He snapped his satchel shut with finality. "This is far from over, deputy," he stated, his voice dripping with contempt. He shot a look of pure venom at the Claibornes and the children. A temporary setback. The law will have its due. He turned on his heel and strode out of the church, his precise footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Silas, deflated and seething, allowed Deputy Morgan to lead him away, muttering dark threats under his breath. As the church emptied, the tension seeped out of the room, replaced by a fragile, trembling relief. Martha sank onto a pew, pulling Caleb, Liza, and Ben into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. Eli placed a large hand on Caleb's head, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You spoke true, Caleb," he said, his voice thick. "You spoke brave." Later that day, back in the warm sanctuary of the mercantile, Caleb found a small wooden box on a shelf behind the counter, one that had held fancy buttons. He carefully emptied it. Then, he took the tin can from the burlap sack. One by one, he placed the sharp, blue enamel shards of his mother's mug into the box. Each piece was a fragment of pain, a memory of fear and loss. He closed the lid. It wasn't mending it. It was laying it to rest. He placed the box high on a shelf, near a jar of desert wildflowers Martha had picked that morning. Tiny blooms of gold and purple pushing through the harsh earth. Outside, the desert sun beat down, baking the earth. Rattler Creek went about its business. Amos tended the livery horses. Jed Hawkins nursed another drink at the Rattlesnake. But whispers traveled on the dry wind. Whispers about Silas's rage, Josiah's cold departure, and the 3 children now living above the Claiborne mercantile. Ben sat on the floor near the stove, carefully arranging his smooth river stones in a pattern only he understood, a small smile playing on his lips as Eli showed him a picture book of animals. Liza sat at Martha's feet, her corn-husk doll forgotten for a moment as Martha gently guided her small hands, teaching her to braid a length of soft yarn. "Like this, sweetheart," Martha murmured, her voice a balm, gentle and slow. Caleb watched them from the doorway, the familiar knot of fear in his chest loosening, replaced by a warmth as unfamiliar as it was precious. It wasn't perfect. The tin can was empty, but the box held broken pieces. Silas was still in Rattler Creek, jail but simmering. Josiah's threat hung like dust in the air, a reminder that the law could be a slow, grinding wheel. The town's acceptance was wary, fragile. But here now, in the quiet hum of the mercantile, with the scent of coffee and cinnamon and the sound of Martha's gentle instruction, Caleb felt something he hadn't known since his mother's touch, a fragile, fiercely guarded peace. It was a dream life born from desert dust and desperation, offered by hands that had known their own deep sorrow. It wasn't an ending, he knew. The desert wind still whispered warnings, and shadows lingered at the edge of town. But for the first time, Caleb Hayes dared to believe that the dawn could hold more than just reckonings. It could hold a chance.